The wind dragged across the open plains like a memory, long, low, and aching. It whispered through brittle grass, and moaned against the weathered fence posts that lined the edge of nothing. The sky above was all bone-colored light and smeared cloud, the kind of day that fell unfinished, like someone forgot to write an ending. And there, tied to a splintering fence rail with raw rope biting into her wrists, was a girl no one was looking for. She had the look of something abandoned by more than just a man, abandoned by luck, by God, maybe even by time. Her bare feet pressed against frozen soil, legs trembling beneath the coarse skirt she wore. Her blouse was torn at one shoulder, exposing bruises the color of old plums. Her face, though smeared with dirt and dried blood, still held something intact, not pride exactly, but a stubborn, flickering defiance that refused to let her cry. She didn't scream, didn't beg. She just stood, leaned half against the fence, half against her own will, blinking slow against the wind as it whipped her hair across her cheek in angry, tangled waves. Behind her, the tracks of a single-wheeled wagon had already begun to blur under the restless dirt. He hadn't even looked back. Not once. Her father had tied her here with a cuss on his lips and whiskey on his breath, muttering something about punishment and sin and, "She'll think twice next time." She doubted he remembered any of it now. Or her name. Time passed like molasses turned bitter. The sun rose higher, then shifted. She could no longer feel her fingers. She tried pulling at the ropes until her skin split, but it only made her weaker. Her throat was dry as bone. Her knees ached. And still she stood. Until hoofbeats came. Not loud, soft, like a lullaby played on tired strings. The kind of approach that belonged to a man who didn't want to be noticed. He appeared over the ridge like something carved from the very land itself, tall, still worn. A long duster coat hung from his shoulders like a faded curtain of dusk. His hat was pulled low, casting shadow across his face, but even from a distance, she could tell his eyes weren't searching for her. He was following something else, maybe a lost cow, maybe solitude. But as he neared the fence, his horse huffed and slowed, instinct catching before thought did. He saw her, stopped. For a long moment, he didn't move, just stared like he wasn't sure if she was real. And she, in turn, stared back, body weak, but eyes burning. The wind ruffled his coat. His horse shifted. And finally the man dismounted. No questions. No curses. No sudden pity. He walked over and crouched without a word, his knife already drawn. The blade flashed clean and sharp, slicing through the rope with practiced ease. As the last knot gave way, her body pitched forward, and he caught her before she hit the ground. His arms were strong but hesitant, as though unsure what to do with something so light, so broken. She didn't resist. Couldn't. Her breath came shallow now, her heart thudding like it was running from something her feet couldn't escape. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders. The wool smelled of leather, smoke, and rain that had long since dried. It was warm. She hadn't realized how cold she was until that moment. Still, she didn't speak. Neither did he. He guided her to the horse slowly, one arm around her waist, the other steadying her steps. She stumbled twice, and each time his grip tightened, but not unkindly. When they reached the saddle, he mounted first, then pulled her up gently behind him. Her arms, frail as reeds, circled his waist. Her cheek pressed to his back. She let her eyes close for just a breath. Then they rode. The land rolled beneath them, gold and gray and stubbornly alive. No towns for miles. Just the wide, eternal hush of the frontier. She didn't ask where they were going. She doubted he'd tell her even if she did. The man's silence wasn't empty. It was full of something too heavy for words. By the time the sun drooped low, painting the sky with amber wounds, the cabin appeared. It stood crooked at the edge of a narrow rise, a one-room shack with a stone chimney, a rusted water pump, and smoke curling like a sigh from the roof. A small corral held a pair of goats and a black dog that watched them approach without barking. The place looked forgotten by the world, which made it the safest place she'd seen in years. He helped her down carefully. Her legs nearly gave out, but he caught her again, scooping her into his arms as if she weighed less than dust. She tried to speak then, tried to tell him she could walk, but her voice caught, rasped, and died. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and ash. A cast-iron stove crackled in the corner. A narrow cot lined the far wall. Tools hung from hooks beside a battered bookcase filled with journals and folded maps. There was no sign of anyone else. No woman's touch. No child's toy. just the echo of a man's quiet life. He laid her down on the cot, propping her gently against a pillow stuffed with wool. Then he disappeared to a basin, began to pour water from a jug, setting a kettle on the stove, without comment. His hands moved with calm precision, like someone used to being alone, used to surviving without words. She watched him. Something about him felt steady. Not safe, she didn't believe in safe anymore, but grounded, like the earth beneath her, or the horizon line that never moved no matter how far she ran. When he returned with the cup, she took it with both hands, sipped. It burned her throat in the best way. She tried again to speak, voice barely above a breath. "You ain't gonna sell me, are you?" His eyes flicked to hers. No surprise. No offense. Just that same stillness, that same unreadable calm. He shook his head once. Then he stood and walked to the door, stepping outside into the darkening dusk. She sat in silence, the cup warming her hands, his coat still wrapped around her like a borrowed promise. Through the tiny window, she saw him, leaning against the porch rail, staring out at the dying light. There was no moon yet, only the slow arrival of stars, one by one, like prayers whispered from the edge of nowhere. And somewhere beneath the vastness of it all, she closed her eyes and did not flinch. Not from fear. Not tonight. Something had shifted. She didn't know what it was yet, whether fate or accident or something quieter still, but she knew the feeling of a story beginning. And this one, whatever it was, had just begun. Morning came slow and silver, washing the plains in pale light. Frost clung to the window pane of the cabin like lace made of breath, and inside the girl stirred. Not from comfort, but from the kind of sleep that hovers, half-conscious, half-protective. Her body still ached in quiet protests, but something in her chest had loosened, just enough to let the air in without fear. The coat was still around her, tucked in at the sides. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he'd helped her. But in a land where most men stepped around broken things, he'd picked her up as if she weren't broken at all. He wasn't inside when she sat up, but the faint smell of coffee drifted through the cracks in the wood, and outside, a faint rhythm, hammering, slow and measured, kept time with the rise of the sun. She swung her legs over the side of the cot. The floor was cold. A faded blanket, worn thin in places, lay folded nearby. She took it with her. The door creaked open, and the cold bit at her bones like it had teeth. He was out near the goat pen, fixing a warped section of fence. The black dog padded silently at his feet, tail twitching like it knew all the secrets but wouldn't tell. She stood there for a while, not moving, not waving, just watching. How his arms moved without urgency. How he didn't look up to check if she'd come out. He didn't expect thanks. That made her trust him a little more. Back inside, she found a basin, some water, left warming by the stove, and a cloth. She cleaned herself in slow motions, careful not to flinch at the bruises that mapped her ribs. Each one had a story, but none worth retelling. They were chapters she'd rather burn. Later, he came in, quiet as dusk. Set a tin plate on the table. Eggs, corn mush, a heel of bread. He didn't speak. She didn't either. But she ate. The days unfolded like fragile paper, creased in all the wrong places but held together by small, careful routines. She swept the floor, watered the goats, peeled potatoes when her hands stopped shaking. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not in a way that wanted anything, but in a way that measured distance with gentleness. At night, she sat near the stove, rubbing the calluses from her hands, and he'd read, not aloud, just to himself, one page at a time. The fire would crackle. The dog would sigh, and silence, thick and low, would settle between them like a quilt. One morning, he brought back a book from town. He laid it on the table without a word. It was old, the spine cracked, the title faded, a book of poems, verses scrawled in looping letters like they were meant to be sung. She didn't touch it that first day. But by nightfall, she held it in her lap like something sacred. She read the first line aloud when she thought he was asleep. Asterisk, I will rise again, though the wind tries to bury me. Asterisk. He didn't stir, but he heard. She could tell by the way he shifted, just slightly, the edge of his mouth, bending almost into a smile. They still didn't speak much, but something had started to grow in the empty spaces, something soft and maybe holy. Then came the woman from town. It was her second trip with him. He needed flour, nails, tobacco. She came along only because she didn't want to stay behind, not just yet. Her eyes hadn't trusted stillness in so long that it felt dangerous. The town was small, a dry-throated place with a crooked steeple and faces like weathered stone. Eyes followed them as they passed. She felt them, not curious, but assessing, judging, weighing her. Inside the general store, the old woman behind the counter narrowed her eyes before the girl even stepped through the door. "Well now," the woman muttered, leaning against a barrel. "Heard you took in strays these days." The cowboy said nothing, just placed his coins on the counter. The girl stood still, spine straight. The woman clicked her tongue. "Don't see why she's dressed like a church mouse if she's living in sin." And just like that, the world tilted again. Back to shame. Back to old bruises. Back to words like chains. But the cowboy turned, and for the first time in days, he looked directly at her. Not around her. Not past her. At her. "Go wait outside," he said, voice low. She nodded, walked out, and when he joined her 5 minutes later, he handed her a single wrapped package, a brush, coarse but clean. "For your hair," he said. That night, she cried for the first time. Not because she was afraid. Because someone had seen her. Days blurred into weeks. The sky shifted from winter gray to a warmer hue. She began to hum when she worked, small, broken tunes that curled up from her chest like smoke. She found the garden behind the cabin and started clearing weeds, her hands deep in the dirt. Sometimes the dog would sit beside her, tail thumping. Sometimes the cowboy would pass by, his shadow long in the early light, nodding once as he walked. He still never asked about her past. Never asked what her name used to be. But one night, after dinner, he sat beside her and said only this: "You can stay." 3 words. Not "you should." Not "I want you to." You can. Like permission wrapped in respect. She looked at him, and for the first time, allowed herself a small smile. "I know," she whispered. The next morning, she woke early and found the cabin empty. He was already out with the goats. She moved through the quiet house, stirring embers in the stove, folding her blanket, brushing her hair with the gift he'd given her. And then she found the journal. It had been left open on the table, not by accident, she thought, but not quite intentionally either. The page was covered in neat handwriting. Lists, measurements, and something else. At the bottom, scribbled in smaller letters, were words she recognized. A poem, not from the book, but in the same rhythm. Asterisk, where the wind stops screaming and the ground grows still. "I'll build you a place if you'll let me." Asterisk. She stared at it for a long time. Didn't touch it. Didn't speak of it. But when he came back inside, and they passed by each other near the door, she didn't step aside. She let his arm brush hers. And neither of them apologized. That evening, as the stars blinked to life one by one, she sat on the porch with him. No words. Just the creak of wood and the hush of twilight. A breeze stirred the long grass, and the black dog chased a moth through the dirt. She thought, not for the first time, that maybe healing didn't happen like thunder. Maybe it came like this. Quiet. Repeated. Patient. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and handed it to her. She opened it. It was a map, hand-drawn, of the land around them. He'd marked a spot with an X near the edge of the property. Near a rise she'd never walked to yet. "What is it?" she asked. His voice was soft. "A barn. Or a schoolhouse. Maybe both." "For what?" "For whatever you want." She looked at the paper again, then back at him. Her chest felt tight. Not with fear, but with the ache of hope, that unfamiliar, stubborn thing. And just before the darkness took the last color from a world, she reached out. Not to touch his hand, but to place her own over the mark on the map. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He nodded. And for the first time since she was tied to that fence, the world didn't feel like it was pulling her apart. It felt like it was waiting for her to begin. The wind changed one morning, sharp, sudden, like a door slammed in the distance. The girl felt it before she saw the clouds roll in, her fingers pausing over the rough beams of the half-built barn. She stood on the rise they'd marked together, where the soil had finally softened under her care. For days now, they'd worked in tandem, he with nails and measured cuts, she with her hands in the earth, planting wildflowers near the base where windows would one day catch the sunrise. But that morning, something in the horizon pulled her gaze backward. She didn't yet know what dread felt like without bruises. Didn't recognize how the stomach twisted when fear came not from violence, but from memory trying to become real again. He noticed her silence before the rain came. She didn't speak as they packed away the tools, didn't hum like she usually did. And though he didn't ask why, his eyes lingered on her longer than they had in weeks, not with suspicion, but with awareness, like he knew the air carried something heavy. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, arms wrapped tight around her knees, watching shadows lean long across the field. The dog growled once, low and uncertain, before settling again by the door. And then, just before dawn, hoofbeats. Not the quiet rhythm of a solitary rider. No, this was reckless. Loud. The kind of sound that didn't care if it woke the dead. She was on her feet before he was. He reached for the rifle leaning against the hearth, already knowing. When the knock came, it wasn't polite. It rattled the wood like it wanted to break it. She didn't breathe. He opened the door. A man stood there, soaked in drink and mud, his shirt unbuttoned, a pistol hanging carelessly at his side. The girl didn't need to see his face to know. Her father had found her. She shrank back, eyes darting for corners, for exits, for anything that could be a shield. But the cowboy didn't flinch. He stood in the doorway like a stone carved into a man, his voice low and firm. "You're not welcome here." The drunk man snorted, stepping forward. "That's my girl. Ain't your say where she belongs." His words slurred but sharp. Mean in that special way that only family could be. The cowboy shifted, just slightly, the rifle resting in his hands like it had always belonged there. "She's not yours. Not anymore." The girl stepped forward then, past the flickering firelight, her body trembling but upright. Her voice caught once before it came out clear. "You left me to die." Her father blinked as if confused. "What?" "You tied me to a fence and left." His lip curled, a sneer struggling to form. "You needed teachin'. That's all." She didn't move, didn't cry. Her shoulders were squared, her voice steady. "You don't get to teach me any more." For a long beat, the three of them stood there, suspended in the silence. Then he raised the gun. Not fast, not well. His hand trembled with drink, not rage, but enough to make her breath catch, her knees weaken. And before she could scream, a shot cracked through the night. But not from the cowboy. From the trees. The girl turned just in time to see a puff of dust explode from her father's hand, the pistol flying from his grip. Someone stepped out of the dark. The preacher from town, tall, thin, with a shotgun cradled in his arms and a face carved by quiet conviction. He didn't speak. Didn't have to. The father howled, clutching his wrist, stumbling backward into the mud. And then, just like that, he turned and fled, shouting slurred curses, disappearing into the wind like he was never meant to exist. No one moved for a long time. The preacher lowered his weapon, nodded once to the cowboy, once to the girl, then turned and walked back into the trees, the sound of his steps swallowed by the storm that had finally broken overhead. Rain fell in long, unhurried sheets, soaking the earth in silence. The girl sat on the porch steps, legs drawn up to her chest, face tilted to the sky. The cowboy stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes distant. She spoke first. "He'll be back." "Maybe." The rain pattered harder, drumming on the roof like a heartbeat. "Do you think he'll try again?" "I think some men only know how to chase ghosts. You're not one." She looked at him, then truly looked, past the quiet, past the rough hands and stitched scars. She saw the man who had found her broken, and never asked why. And for the first time, she reached out. Not for safety, but for steadiness. He took her hand. They sat like that, palms pressed together, rain softening the night around them. Over the next days, the town whispered. Of course they did. Some claimed the preacher had no business meddling. Others said the cowboy had stolen what wasn't his. A few offered kindness. Most offered silence. But the girl no longer listened to voices not meant for her. She walked through the town now with her head high, the bruises on her arms faded but not forgotten. She wore her hair down, the brush lines softening her curls. She spoke to the mute boy who gave her a flower once, taught him how to draw letters in the dirt behind the church. And at the edge of the cowboy's land, the barn took shape, one beam at a time. She worked side by side with him, measuring lengths, hammering nails, tracing calloused fingers over worn wood. They spoke little, but the work itself was conversation. One evening, as they nailed the final plank to the front frame, she paused and leaned against the wall. "What do you think it should be?" she asked. He glanced up. "Whatever you want." She thought of the books in his shelf, the children who never learned to read, the quiet she used to fear. A place where no one yells. He nodded. "That's a good start." They didn't finish the roof that night. Instead, they lit a fire inside the skeleton of the barn, sat on overturned crates, and let the heat soak into their bones. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, the poem he'd once scribbled in his journal. She handed it to him. "I rewrote it," she said. He unfolded the page, read it in silence. The last line was new. Asterisk, where wind once screamed and ground once split. I choose to stand. I choose to stay. Asterisk. He looked up, and though neither of them smiled fully, something passed between them, not love, not yet, but something that tasted like trust. That night, she slept in the cabin, while the rain returned. But she dreamed of wildflowers blooming where her past had once bled into the soil. And when she woke, she walked out barefoot to the barn. She found him there, already hammering. And beside him, a second tool belt, waiting. The barn rose like a promise over the prairie. Timbers squared and sanded, roof sealed with care, windows framed to catch light that hadn't even risen yet. The wildflowers she'd planted around its base had begun to bloom, stubborn things with color too bright for the dust they lived in. She often sat beside them before sunrise, legs folded beneath her, brush in one hand, letters in the other. She wasn't sure what to call it yet, this place, this thing they'd built, but she knew what it felt like. Solid, rooted, real. Word had spread slow, the way good things always did. First came the boy, the mute one, still carrying the flower she'd given back to him, now dried and wrapped in twine. She taught him his name first, carved it into wood, made him trace the letters until he could do it, without her hand guiding his. Then came another child, and then another. Daughters of field hands, sons of seamstresses, quiet ones, broken ones, ones who flinched when doors slammed too hard. They came with calloused fingers and open eyes, and she met them all with the same calm resolve. The barn became more than shelter. It became a map, each child a marker, each word a road leading out of silence. They brought scraps of paper, bits of coal, blunted pencils. She taught them the sound of each letter, like it was a note in a song they'd never known how to sing. And always he was there. Not in the center, never leading, but on the edges, steady and sure. Fixing a hinge, mending a saddle, smoothing the path between the barn and the house. The quiet things. The heavy things. One day he brought her a desk, handmade, carved from the remains of the old fence where she'd once been tied. He didn't say where he'd found the wood, but she knew. And when she ran her fingers over the grain, she felt nothing but power. Not fear. Not memory. Power. Still, she didn't ask him for more. Didn't speak of love. Didn't name what lived between them. She had learned that love, real love, was not thunder. It was drought. It was the waiting. The long, patient blooming of something deep and unseen. And then one night the sheriff arrived. He came by horse, slow and respectful, hat in his hands, apology already softening his eyes. She stepped onto the porch, the black dog at her feet, the cowboy emerging from the barn behind her. The sheriff nodded once. "It's about your father." She didn't flinch. He hesitated before he spoke again, voice gentle. "Found him dead. Saloon brawl down near Redwater. No witnesses. No law left to hold." The words landed without sound. She looked past the sheriff, past the horse and the ridge and the amber-tipped sky. Then she nodded. "Thank you," she said, and walked back inside. No tears came. Not that night. Not the next. Only a stillness, like something long buried, had finally stopped clawing toward the surface. She burned the last dress he'd ever touched, fed the ashes to the wind, then returned to her desk, to her students, to the names she taught them to write with careful pride. Weeks passed. The barn's windows were hung with curtains she'd sewn herself. The children brought her wild bird feathers and shiny stones and smiles that grew steadier each day. One afternoon, the mute boy finally whispered a word into her palm. Safe. She cried then, not from sadness, but from the fullness of it. And when the last child left that evening, she didn't return to the cabin. Instead, she walked the field. He was there, hammering something new to the post outside the barn. She watched from a distance as he stepped back, adjusted the nails, then stood quiet with his arms crossed. It was a sign, carved in clean, steady lines. The school at Stillwater Rise. She approached slowly, the twilight painting the sky in violets and soft blue. "Stillwater," she murmured. He turned, gave a single shrug. "Thought it fit." Her gaze lingered on the letters, then slid back to him. "You didn't ask me." "I didn't have to." She didn't reply. Instead, she reached up and touched the sign, like blessing it, like believing it. He reached into his coat, then, drawing out something small, something wrapped in linen, and tied with twine. She took it in her hands carefully, the weight of it no heavier than memory. Inside, she found a locket. Wood-carved, sanded smooth, opening on a tiny hinge. On one side, a dried wildflower, one of hers. On the other, a folded note. She opened it. Asterisk, you weren't lost. Just waiting to be found. Asterisk. Her breath caught like something sacred had whispered her name. She looked up. I don't know how to belong to anything, she said. He stepped closer. Not to take her hand, not to hold her, just to be near. You don't have to. This place belongs to you. Silence followed, but not empty. She didn't cry, didn't speak. She leaned her head against his chest, just once, just for a moment. He let her, and when she stepped back, she knew it would not need to be said aloud. That night, the stars came early. The porch creaked under his boots as he returned to the cabin, the dog padding beside him. She lingered behind, standing at the threshold of the barn. Firelight spilled through the windows, warm and flickering, casting her shadow long across the earth. In her pocket, the locket. In her heart, something steady. Inside the barn, the desks waited. Outside, the wind carried no threats. Only stories. She would teach them to tell their own, these children. Not just with ink and paper, but with the way they stood, the way they stayed, the way they planted roots in the places that once broke them. And when one of the girls asked her a week later, small hands clasped behind her, voice shy and hopeful, "Are you the teacher or the cowboy's wife?" She smiled, brushing a curl from her cheek, the locket warm at her neck. "Both," she said, "in a way." And that was enough. The story would go on. Maybe not with gunfights or gold or thunder in the hills, but with kindness. With rooms full of soft voices, with the sound of chalk on wood and feet in tall grass, and laughter returned to mouths that had once known only silence. Out on Stillwater Rise, where wildflowers grew, where pain had once been buried, she built a life not from ruins, but from the choice to stay. And as long as the wind moved, someone would remember. Someone would whisper. She was left behind. And still she bloomed.